Welcome, everyone, to the International Spy Museum. I'm Peter Ernest, the Executive Director. Delighted to see you all here. Let me give you a sense of format. What we'll do is I will just make some introductory remarks here, including remarks on our three speakers. And each of them will come up and do perhaps 15 minutes presentation, join the panel here, and then we will open it up. I may have a question or two, but we will open it up from questions from the floor. So, having witnessed the presidential debates and the difficulty the moderator had, I can only hope for smooth sailing with three people who are authorities on the Middle East. Let me just preface my remarks by saying I'm delighted to see this turnout. This is a country about which there was a talk barely a year ago of possibly our invading or doing some sort of aggressive action. It is a country whose president, Ahmadinejad, has proved perplexing for many speakers, although I noticed all of the debaters, including the vice presidential debaters, had the name down cold. So I think my guess is that took a degree of practice for them to get that. So our first speaker this evening will be Robert Baer, who joined the CIA in 1976, was a graduate of Georgetown, and he was there for some 20 years in the clandestine service, which is the operations side. Most of that was spent in the Middle East. Seymour Hersh said of him, Baer was considered perhaps the best on-the-ground field officer in the Middle East. While he was there, he gained a very thorough knowledge of the Middle East, the Arab world, and the former republics of the Soviet Union. He speaks Arab fluently, and unfortunately, from personal knowledge, I can tell you that there are not many of those in CIA, so in one sense, I'm sorry to see you out. They probably still need you. For the past 2 years, Bob has worked closely with the Channel 4 production company in the UK and produced 4 documentaries. One was the Suicide Bomber 1, and then Suicide Bomber 2 and Suicide Bomber 3. He also did a documentary on car bomb, which is the first film that's been done on perhaps the deadliest weapon of the 21st century. His books, I think, as you know, See No Evil, which is his autobiography, and Sleeping with the Devil, were the basis for the 205 Academy Award-winning Warner Brothers film Syriana, for which, as I recall, George Clooney got the Best Supporting Actor Award. And my understanding is, you can correct this, that for the film, Clooney gained weight in order to play you. And you can correct this when you come up here. No, you get a response, okay? And that when you heard this, you immediately started a working out project to see if you could bring that back down. Okay. Thomas Powers, who's one of the finest writers on intelligence matters, comment on Bob's most recent book, which is the one which is on sale now, The Devil We Know, dealing with the new Iranian superpower. Thomas Powers said of it, the most important and original book on the Middle East to appear in many years. This is a book McCain and Obama should ponder. This book will be available for signing, as well as a couple of other of Bob's books, in the back after the panel. Bob, just to stand up for a minute so I get a quick recognition, okay? And welcome to the Spy Museum. Let me make one request, by the way. As you can see, we have the press here, both print and by way of electronic media. So I would ask all of you, if you would please turn off your cell phones, particularly BlackBerries, PDAs, and so forth. We have had instances where it does seem to interfere with the pickup by the electronic media. Thank you. Our second speaker will be Keith Crane, a senior economist with the RAND Corporation, specializing in the Middle East, energy, post-conflict societies, and transition economies. He was the lead author on the monograph, Iran's Political, Demographic, and Economic Vulnerabilities. We have that as well, so that will be available for signing after the panel. And the purpose of that book was to assess trends in Iran, to help address U.S. foreign policy issues dealing with Iran. He's been interviewed by the international press and media, written articles for the print media, Christian Science Monitor, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you would just please stand for a moment, Keith, so we'll get the recognition. Okay. And finally, Ali Nader. He is an Iran and Middle East analyst, also at the RAND Corporation, specializing in Iranian national security policy, military doctrine, and domestic politics. He is particularly interested in how government and military structures shape Iranian policies regarding vis-a-vis Iraq and the Persian Gulf region. He has conducted extensive research on Iranian factional politics and decision-making, currently focusing on the 2009 Iranian presidential election and the growing role of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iranian politics. If you would please, Ali, just for a moment, let us welcome you. Okay. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. So I will go ahead and relinquish the podium to Bob Baer. Bob, we're delighted to have you. Okay, go ahead. I'll help you.
Okay, thanks. I'll need it too.
All right.
First of all, I wasn't the best case officer in the CIA, nor the best Arabist, but I did try. There are a lot of them out there that speak Arabic better than I do and know the Middle East better, but what I do have is a certain dint of experience. And I'd say that my first real lesson in the Middle East happened in 1983, April, when a young man parked a truck, a GMC truck, at the end of the Corniche. It was at noon. Schools were let out at the time, or getting out at the time. Traffic in Beirut, 1983. It resumed the old Beirut. Beirut was an absolutely beautiful city. April is the best month. Restaurants were open. The United States had just replaced the Israelis in Beirut. It was going to be a new era of democracy, new economy. The Palestinians were out. Lebanon was on the verge of recognizing Israel. It was, the Reagan administration couldn't have been happier. This kid waits for a signal. Mercedes coming down the Corniche. The Mercedes come by, they wave at him, he starts a GMC pickup truck. It's sort of listing to one side, and it heads down the Corniche in traffic. More or less unnoticed, except for a couple people. At the last minute, it turns left, drives through the portico of the U.S. Embassy, up the steps, and explodes. And as we all know, the building pancakes. The Marine on post 1, they never found him. It was such a large explosion. They had taken acetylene tanks, and they had used PETN. This was a professional operation. I'd come into the CIA being a sort of a student of terrorism, and no one had ever seen anything like this. Not only that, the bomber was never announced. It was claimed by the Islamic Jihad organization. We were all of a sudden faced with a new weapon. We were faced with a group without a face, without a return address. Over the years, we pieced together that it was Iran that was behind this bombing. It was Iran, as we know, was behind the Marine bombing, second embassy bombing, the kidnapping of Americans. It was Iran through, if I can use the word, asymmetrical warfare / terrorism that drove us out of Lebanon. And Lebanon was the piece, the centerpiece of Reagan's foreign policy in the Middle East. It was Lebanon and the hostages that almost brought the Reagan administration down in 1986 with Iran-Contra. I was in Beirut at the time. I met Ollie North there. But what was more important at that point, and we didn't realize what was going on, is we were at the beginning of an 18-year war against the most formidable military in the Middle East, in the sense that everybody speaks Arabic, combat trained, won major victories, the best equipped military in the Middle East. Over those 18 years, and I take this back to 1982 because the first bombing against the Israelis was in Tyre, November 11th. Same thing, a car bomb. The Israelis were forced out. Israel managed to cover this up in the sense they said it was a political defeat rather than a military defeat, that the Israelis got tired of fighting and came home. Now, this changed in 2006 during the 34-day war when the Israelis were soundly beaten. And I will take the Winograd Commission report saying is that Israel had lost its deterrence capability. What is clear, and this was not an intelligence failure, Iran was fighting Israel by proxy. I call it an empire by proxy. But it was Iranian officers on the ground providing equipment, providing guidance, providing discipline to Hezbollah, which beat the Israelis. This is, we didn't notice the war here because there were no victory parades. There were small battles, small skirmishes. When it was all over, the Israelis left quietly. What we miss here as well, the profound effect this has had on the Middle East, Iran's victory in Lebanon. And it is in the Middle East looked as Iran's victory. For the first time, Israel was beaten. For the first time, the Arabs took their revenge, if you like. And it vaulted Hassan Nasrallah into the new Salah ad-Din of the Middle East. There's no question that Hassan Nasrallah is an Iranian, I'll say it, a general, if you like. He listens to Iran, he gets his money from Iran, he gets his training from Iran. The discipline comes from Iran as well. These are relationships that are acknowledged by Hassan Nasrallah. Hassan Nasrallah is extraordinarily honest. If he's corrupt, we don't know it. When Beirut was rebuilt in 2006, 2007, it was done quickly, much more quickly than we've been able to move in Iraq. This whole status of Hezbollah and Iran has spread like a virus to Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. Which takes me to the point where I keep on getting asked the question, but Hassan Nasrallah is an Arab. He's of Semitic blood, and the Iranians are Persians. They're Indo-Europeans. It's not going to work. Well, it worked in Lebanon. It's working in Iraq as well. It's slow. But Ryan Kroc, our ambassador, said, was it 3 weeks ago, it's Iran that is blocking the basing agreements, and Iran alone. The military has said the same thing. They are training militias for the day that they're going to take that country and confront the United States. I obviously don't know the outcome of that conflict, but it's on its way. Again, let me go back to the 2006 war. To the surprise of the Israelis, with a modified Silkworm missile, they hit a corvette and killed 4 Israeli sailors, came out of nowhere. Those same missiles are along the Persian Gulf. And Iran has looked at the balance of power in the Middle East. And he looked at Iraq in particular. I was in Baghdad in April 2003, and there were Iranians wandering around looking at all these nice little holes in the glasses of Saddam Hussein's tanks. And trust me, the Iranians are smart. They figured this out. They can't beat the United States in a conventional war. They can't beat the United States in a nuclear war, of course, either. But they can do it asymmetrically. They now have the deterrence that Israel lost, and that's simply by taking out 4 or 5 tankers in the Middle East. I mean, coming out of the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, they could hit Abqaiq with missiles. And as my understanding is that it would take us many days to take all those missiles out. In the meantime, you drop a couple missiles into Abqaiq, 6 million barrels are off the market. Hedge funds tell me the price of gas, and this has changed, of course, goes up to $10 to $12 a gallon. If that's not exactly what's, not that we can trust hedge funds these days, but yeah, but the point is, it's a deterrence that any president is going to hit Iran has to think about. You're fine, we can go into Tehran. When I sat down to write this book, I proposed to the publisher that I write the best and the brightest when it came to Iran. How did we lose Iran? I mean, not just how we lost Iran, but how did we miss it all these years? Why did we ignore it? Why was it a can we kicked down the road? It was a war nobody wanted to fight, including Reagan, including this administration, knew it couldn't fight. And the publisher said, well, you're not David Halberstam, so why don't you try something else? And, you know, your personal point of view. And all my years in the CIA, I served on the periphery. And I was in Tehran in '78, leading up to the revolution, and the place was absolutely confusing, as it was confusing to the Iranians as well, and to Khomeini when he eventually came back. He didn't know what to do with the country. I was a student of Iran during the 8-year war, and it was probably the bloodiest, it was the bloodiest war after World War II in the 20th century. Iranians lost anywhere from 1 million to 2 million people. And the fact that we don't even know how many people they lost tells you how devastating. In the CIA, we all assumed that the Iranians were irrational, beyond help, and it was a matter of the place would just simply collapse under its own belief, or its own confidence God was on its side. The terrorism continued in those years, which was also for us another side of its irrationality, and that the state would fail. The last Iranian terrorist attack was in 1996, which was Kobar Barracks. You know, you get into the EFPs and IEDs and the rest. That's another issue. I want to call that something else. And then the amazing thing is, in the last 12 years, they have abandoned terrorism against civilians, in particular. In the 2006 war, anybody who knows Beirut, in a matter of minutes, they could have hauled in 100 Americans as hostages. The orders came down from Tehran, don't touch the Americans. That was completely followed throughout Hezbollah, which in a way, for me, is a bit scarier, because if Iran has this kind of confidence, it's not going to resort to terrorism and is more of a rational power, they are able to calculate our moves and are a serious strategic threat to us in the Middle East. And what I find is this arc that I followed from 1978 in Beirut, in Syria, and the rest of the Middle East, is they have become a rational power. And the good news is that we can negotiate with a rational power. If indeed they are, and they remain this way, and I think they are, there are points we can discuss. We cannot discuss with bin Laden. We can't find him. We can't get to the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. We can't go to those cities. We can't talk to these people. And my last point is that in these suicide bombing films, I spent, of all things, a couple months in Israeli jails. It's just the most amazing thing. Could you imagine an American prison wandering around a jail, unsupervised, talking to the prisoners? That's what happened in Israel. It was quite remarkable. And anyhow, I talked to the bombers, and what you kept on noticing over and over again, in Shia Islam, there's a discipline. They can turn this stuff off as they did in 2006, or they can turn it back on, suicide bombing. The Sunni, on the other hand, have a very vague idea what they want to do with suicide bombings. It was, do unto your enemy as they do to you, which means nothing at all. I mean, if you think you're being oppressed and slaughtered, then you just slaughter other people and it doesn't matter. So you see Hamas and Islamic Jihad killing civilians randomly, but if you look at Iran and its terrorism in a narrow point of view, it's mostly targeted against military targets. Tyre was a military building. They looked at our embassies as military. Of course, the exceptions are Argentina. But like everything in the Middle East, the news is always relative. And I think if it ever came to the point we had to pick sides, and this is a huge statement, that we'd be better off leaving our traditional allies, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and gravitating toward Iran. That's a tall order. It would have to involve Iraq, where we have common interest avoiding a civil war. And like most grand plans, they don't work. But I really do think this stands a better chance of working than it did in 1984 or 86 during Iran-Contra. And this is the case I try to make, and I'm sure there's probably a lot of experts here, but yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, next is Keith Crane, Senior Economist at the RAND Corporation.
Hi, I'm going to talk about a study that we've recently completed at RAND about Iran's political, demographic, and economic vulnerabilities. It's available back here, but you can also download it for free off our website, www.rand.org, if you don't mind reading off your, printing your paper. It's part of a body of research at RAND that we have conducted over the last several years looking at Iran. And what we've tried to do here is that we've done quite a bit of work on the nuclear issue. The purpose of this particular study was to put the nuclear issue aside and just to ask questions about how can we influence this country, what are their vulnerabilities, and what particular policies could the United States use in order to, in essence, exploit those vulnerabilities to come up with policies in Iran that would be more favorable to the United States and, in my view, more favorable to both Iran and the region as well. Through the course of the study, we first looked at population. One of the things that I found quite interesting is Iran now has the lowest rate of population growth of any country in the region, including Lebanon and Israel, which tend to have lower rates of growth. And what has happened in this country then is that we've seen a shift of what people aspire to, in essence, a very urbanized society. In a period in the 1980s where Iran had an explosion in terms of population growth after Khomeini came in, there was an abrupt change in policy in 1989 by the Ayatollahs. Kind of shows that there's some pragmatism as well to take a very strong policy to try to control population growth, and that has resulted both in terms of consequence of urbanization, some religious rulings which actually promoted birth control, to a situation where today population is growing very slowly, but it is also a population in which the numbers of young people that were born in the 80s and into the early 90s now are coming into the labor force. So you have no longer pressures for schools and for schools for young people and new housing, but we are seeing as a big push right now in Iran due to this change in demographics and population for young people looking for jobs. The other aspect of Iran, of course, is that it's highly ethnically diverse. It's the most ethnically diverse nation in the region, putting aside Afghanistan. Roughly just a little over half of the population are ethnically Persian, and then you have an amalgam of Arabs and Kurds and Azeris, who are about a quarter of the population. And so what has often been a focus of U.S. policy is say, well, how can we use this ethnic diversity to advance our own policy goals? Here, the news is not is one of cautionary. And what has happened in Iran is that although it's highly ethnically diverse, the most important minority outside the Persians, which are the Azeris, are very, very closely integrated into the politic. And so you can actually see this whenever you see international soccer games. The entire country goes out. They don't care if you're Arab or Kurd or whatever. At that point in time, everybody's an Iranian. But what has happened is that the Ayatollahs have used this combination of nationalism, which was really ingrained into Iran during the Iraqi-Iranian War, which we talked about before, but also the Shiaism has created a dual identity for both Iranians. They both look at their ethnicity. They speak Azeri at home, or they're speaking Kurdish at home, but at the same time, they also feel that they're very much Iranian. We then looked at questions of what could you do in what's going on with the economy. First, there's been some thought that Iran might run out of oil. This is not the case. We've seen a situation where the Iranian National Oil Company has been able to kind of keep production up, although production has declined in recent years. And it is one of the major, of course, it has the largest oil reserves in the world, about coming in number 3 or number 4. That said, there are some problems here. The Iranian government has counterproductive economic policies when it comes to oil. Number one, they subsidize gasoline. Gasoline goes for about 8 cents a gallon. As you can imagine, people use it when it's 8 cents a gallon. And so we've seen a huge increase in terms of domestic consumption of gasoline, and a very large amount of the oil exports now are actually going to pay for domestic gasoline consumption. The other thing that's happened is the Iranians are very difficult to work with. And so time and time again, they have actually written contracts with foreign oil companies, be those Chinese or Total is a French company, or at times Japanese, and they're been so difficult to work with that these have fallen apart. So on the one hand, you have a country with very large oil reserves. On the other hand, you've seen a government which is very, very reliant on oil revenues to fund its operations, including that of the military, the nuclear program, and a government that's been so difficult to work with that it's been difficult to expand oil output, because whenever they try to come to close to an agreement with a foreign company who has better expertise, usually the foreign company gives up in disgust and backs away. Oil, however, is not the most important part of the Iranian economy. I think there's a misperception here. It only accounts for roughly 25% of GDP. Iran, with over 70 million people, has probably the most diverse economy in the Middle East. And since oil prices have risen, that has kind of fed into the rest of the economy. You've seen a pretty rapid rates of economic growth since the low point in '98, with growth in construction and retail and trade manufacturing. The problem, of course, for Iranians has been that, on the one hand, talked about before about demographically, all these young people coming onto the labor market, and they are really restricted in terms of the opportunities that they have for their lives. Most of them actually, the United States, in fact, is the most popular. Iran is the country where we have the highest popularity rating in the Middle East outside of Israel. Most people would like to go to California or New York or someplace else and make their way. What has happened is that although you can get a job working for your uncle or your father in a store or running a taxi or small businesses, otherwise most people gravitate into these large enterprises which are controlled by the government or controlled by the bonyads, which is a foundation which is controlled by the religious establishment. And the way you get ahead over time is either through patronage, that is your uncle or your brother, your neighbor, the people who run the operation and they give you the job, or if you're running a small business, you have to provide kickbacks. So there's a lot of frustration among young people in Iran because they don't really have the opportunities to set up their own business and let it grow. Because if it grows too rapidly, they're going to have to pay off the powers that be. If they want a job, they're going to have to kowtow to somebody and become part of the patronage network. That said, it has been a period of fairly rapid economic growth. You can talk about Iran now as being kind of a middle income, maybe still a little bit lower middle income, but middle income developing country. A country, however, that has really been constrained in recent years by really counterproductive economic policies. And part of the problems we've seen in the coming presidential campaign, that is in June of next year, is that during this period of high oil prices, a period when most Iranians expected to see kind of a big payoff from oil exports, what has happened instead is we've seen a rapid increase in inflation. And all economic growth has been pretty high. It's been unevenly distributed. People go look at northern parts of Tehran. There's some beautiful homes up there. At the same time, where they're living is they're paying some of the highest rents in the world relative to income. And so there's quite a bit of frustration in Iran, even in this period of high oil prices. So kind of bottom line, what are the key vulnerabilities to Iran? In terms of the economy, oil is very important both for export earnings and budget revenues. 4/5 of their export earnings come from oil. Over 60% of the budget comes from oil. So as a consequence, if oil prices continue to go down, this government is going to face some real severe budgetary constraints. The other vulnerability for Iran tends to be that most oil exports are located at a single port. It's called Karg Island, which is in the Persian Gulf. and all of that oil has to go through the Straits of Hormuz. So there's some very key vulnerabilities in terms of oil. The second point is that although the demographic situation, population growth has slowed, you're looking at a period where you have a number of unhappy people, highly educated or much more highly educated young people who have higher aspirations of how they want to live their lives and have really a hankering to become at least part of the West. Internet access is ubiquitous. People there's blogs in Farsi and all the languages that are used in Iran. And so people are quite aware, at least through the blogs and the internet, about what's going on in the rest of the world. So you have this situation where you have gerontocratic religious leadership, which does permit elections kind of as a safety valve to let people express their, express their political interests, and actually results in elections of some individuals who oppose their leadership. But at the same time, you have a situation where young people really want to become part of the modern world. So what can the United States do about these vulnerabilities? In some ways, if push come to shove, it's considered an act of war. We do have opportunity to put a blockade in the Iranian oil exports. This would have a severe damage to the Iranian economy. It would also be considered an act of war. We also have opportunities in terms of providing embargoes on particular technologies. One of those has been quite effective, and Iran has a lot of natural gas, either the second or third largest reserves in the world. They are unable to liquefy this gas in place of current, in the context of the current embargo on that technology, and that's been quite useful. But so finally, what can the U.S. do in terms of Iran? I think the important thing to think about in Iran is that we need to think of this as a long-term game. The current conditions right now in Iran, we have a presidential election coming over the next 6 months. There is some opportunity that we would come up with a better president, although the president is not, of course, the leader of the country. The supreme leader is, but nonetheless, the president has an important role in Iran. So the idea here is that we should be taking our policies and really focusing on how do we really use these vulnerabilities to hopefully create an Iran, or use these social and political changes that would lead to an Iran that's more of interest in terms of our, would take actions in more of our interests, and I would also argue Iranian interests. Right now, if you look at Iran, none of its neighbors like it. I mean, there are not a single country in the area, with the partial exception of Iraq, really sees Iran as a friend or a country that they can count on. At the same time, Iran really feels divorced from most of the rest of the world. Our European allies don't see it as a reliable partner. And so there's a lot of social areas in which there are social and economic areas in which changes can be made. What are some of those? One, we really need to set up a special interest section within Tehran so we can have more Iranians come to the United States and travel back and forth. We have this extraordinarily dynamic Iranian community in the United States. People always laugh at the reason why the Iranians don't want a U.S. interest section to open up, because there would be 3 miles of 3 mile long lines out there, people asking for visas to go and visit. But nonetheless, it's very important. We need to expand opportunities for Iranians to come here. We also need to get U.S. People like yourselves, but also U.S. policymakers out there in the Iranian media. The media is controlled, but at the same time it can be open. The internet's open, but also I spoke on a talk show on a Tehran television a few months ago. Even though I spoke in English, nonetheless, it has a fairly wide viewership there. The other thing we need to do, at least in my view, in terms of the economy, is really kind of push for both the World Bank and the IMF to be very active in Iran, and also open up opportunities for Iran to join the World Trade Organization. Right now, the government is really a kleptocratic government. Opportunities for young people or even businessmen to operate outside of that political economic nexus is virtually nil. By kind of opening things up, you can really open up opportunities for people who are outside the government to expand their economic opportunities and to create alternative sources of political and economic power. At the same time, we should be working closely. I would also say we have to take a more realistic policy view towards Iran. It makes no sense to try to stir up these ethnic groups to to try to overthrow the government, and that's just not strong enough. If you look at 75% of the population is either Persian or they're Azeri. There's really no evidence that those types of groups are really in a position to overthrow this government. Instead of trying to take a view of trying to do regime overthrow, I would call it a policy of regime, or undermining the regime by helping the Iranians to pursue their own goals to have a freer, more democratic, more liberal economy. And then finally, however, I think it's important to really target our sanctions on key Iranian figures. We've done this in terms of encouraging our European allies to deny visas to certain individuals. We blockaded bank accounts, and we should continue with this policy of not providing technologies for gas liquefaction for Iran. So those are some of the suggestions we had in the volume. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Next is Ali Nader, an Iran and Middle East analyst, also at the RAND Corporation.
Good evening. Well, there's no doubt that Iran presents the most serious challenge to U.S. interests in the Middle East. It is arguably the most influential player in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, and the Persian Gulf region. It supports terrorist groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and conceivably even the Taliban. It has a weak conventional military. Its military equipment is largely outdated. It has a museum-quality air force, but it has the most active missile program in the Middle East and a very secretive nuclear program. And it has threatened to disrupt shipping in the Persian Gulf in the event of a U.S.-Iranian conflict. However, Iran is not as radical or big of a threat as its president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, would like us to believe. There are social and political forces in Iran that compel the country to act moderately. Also, Iran is vulnerable in many ways, like Keith described. It's a contradictory country. In some ways, it's powerful, but it's also a very fragile state, and has been for the last 200 years. In some ways, Iran is a maturing revolutionary state, but it's not fully matured. It's not there yet. And we have to remember the Islamic Revolution took place 30 years ago. And considering the 2,500 years of Iranian history, that's not a large amount of time. And during the last 30 years, Iran's foreign policies and behavior have really fluctuated between radicalism and pragmatism. So it's neither a radical state and it's neither a pragmatist state, but it's in many ways both. If you want to divide the stages of Iranian foreign policy, you can divide them into three. There's the radical phase from the revolution, 1979-80 to 89. There's also a pragmatic phase from 1989 to 2005. And also, there appears to be a return to radicalism under President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was elected in 2005. In order to understand Iran's behavior during these three phases, you have to look at three various factors. One is Iran's history, from the time of the Shah to the Islamic Revolution and beyond. The other is the structure of the Iranian government, and more importantly, the competing ideologies and factions within the Iranian government. The Iranian government is not a unitary actor. In many ways, it's a divided political entity. And the third factor is the forces shaping current Iranian behavior and policies. Well, in looking at the radicalist period, you have to really understand what Iranians were feeling during the revolution. There was a lot of pent-up resentment and anger, especially toward the United States. The Iranian population saw Shah as an authoritarian figure and believed that the United States was propping up the Shah. If you recall, the U.S. organized the 1953 coup that returned the Shah to power. So Iran's foreign policy at that time wasn't fully rational. It was based on emotion and ideology and extremism. As a result, Iran did things not that only hurt itself, but surrounding countries. But ultimately, it did things that hurt its own interests. For example, it tried to export its revolution to Arab countries, and no one really wanted its revolution. Iran tried to sponsor a Shia coup in Bahrain. It set up a Lebanese Hezbollah, and it adopted a policy of undermining the Arab states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And really, Iranian calls for Arab monarchs to be overthrown united those countries behind Saddam Hussein. So it was detrimental to Iranian interests. But among the fundamentalist factions in the revolution, and there are many different groupings, you had nationalists, Marxists, liberals, but among the fundamentalist factions, there was a widespread belief that Iran could export its revolution, that it was applicable to the Arab world and the Islamic world at large. Also, some of the radical events in Iran at that time, the US hostage crisis, for example, had a very domestic dimension that's not often looked at. The fundamentalist factions in Iran that supported Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the revolution, really used that crisis to consolidate their own power and beat the other factions. So you have to consider that factionalism has been a large part of Iranian behavior in the last 30 years. After the end of the Iran-Iraq War and the death of Khomeini in 1989, Iran entered a period of pragmatism. The main goal was economic construction. Iran had suffered tremendous damage, human and material, and the new supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who's still the supreme leader, and President Rafsanjani wanted to really rebuild Iran. So Iran couldn't export its revolution. It needed foreign investment and know-how, and lots of Iranians had left Iran, scientists, technocrats, doctors, etc. I mean, most of them are living in Los Angeles instead of Tehran right now. So Rafsanjani reached out to the Gulf Cooperation Council. He tried to improve relations with Europe. U.S.-Iranian relations stayed pretty tense throughout. And Iran reduced its support for radical groups in the GCC states. After Rafsanjani, you had Khatami come to power. And Khatami wanted to do more than liberalize Iran economically. He wanted to change the system. He didn't think the Islamic Republic could last as it was. So he believed that Iran had to reform politically and socially. And during his reign, Iran pursued moderate policies. If you'll recall, Iran helped the United States not only overthrow the Taliban, but help establish the Afghan government of unity in Kabul in 2001. But it wasn't just because of Khatami's moderate policies that Iran acted like that. The price of oil was really low. In 1998, it reached the low of $10 to $12. So Iran was facing immense economic pressure to open up. It didn't really have a choice at that time. Now, as I mentioned, there's been a return to radicalism, and there are three reasons for that. One, the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 really scared the Iranian regime. There was talk of real men going to Tehran. The Iranians thought they were next. So that showed policies of moderation and cooperation didn't really work. And then you had President Ahmadinejad come to power, and he brought a whole new radical clique with him. And Ahmadinejad believes that Iran should return to its revolutionary purity, that it should return to its Islamist roots, whatever they are. So he doesn't favor cooperation or pragmatism that much anyways. And then you had the high price of oil, which hit $147 in July of 2008. So that allowed Iran a lot of wiggling room. It allowed it to withstand US sanctions, pursue more radical policies by funding Hamas and Hezbollah and its proxies in Iraq. And it also allowed Iran to pursue a very assertive nuclear policy. Khatami and Rafsanjani, although the nuclear program took off under them, were in favor of international cooperation and dialogue. Ahmadinejad has said the nuclear program is a train without brakes. There's no stopping it. But he's not the most powerful person in Iran. The most powerful person is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and that's because Iran has two parallel systems of government. There's an appointed government, which is composed of the supreme leader, of course, but also the Guardian Council, which vets candidates for elections. And then there's an elected government, which is made up of the presidency and parliament. Now, that doesn't mean Ahmadinejad doesn't have any power, because he gets to appoint cabinet ministers, he sets up economic policy, but the supreme leader is constitutionally the most powerful person in Iran. He controls armed forces, and he appoints senior figures in the Guardian Council and other government agencies. But even Khamenei can't make choices by himself. He has to preside over the factions within Iran, the pragmatists, the moderates under Khatami, the radicals under Ahmadinejad. And so important decisions in Iran are made by a form of consensus. So Ahmadinejad does not represent Iranian policies. He has been supported by Khamenei, who likes him more than Rafsanjani and Khatami, because they've challenged him to a certain extent. And so he's thrown his support behind Ahmadinejad for the last couple of years, and he's been explicit about it. Now, looking at Iran's current policies in Iraq and the nuclear policy, I can say it's not just radical, because Iran has shown restraint in Iraq. It has helped reduce violence in Iraq by persuading Muqtada al-Assad to cease some of the activities of his militias. In fact, it's widely believed that Iran was responsible for negotiating the ceasefire in Basra between the Iraqi government forces and Muqtada al-Assad in March of this year. And Iran may be doing that because it's calculating its interests. It feels if the United States is about to strike its nuclear facilities, then it can restrain some of its proxies in Iraq and make things more comfortable for us there. Also, there's no agreement, absolute agreement on the nuclear issue in Iran. The ruling elite is divided as to how it should pursue it. I think there's wide consensus that Iran should have some sort of nuclear capability, but pragmatists like Rafsanjani and Khatami are really worried about the US military threat and sanctions. They don't want Iran to return to what it was 20 years ago. They don't want to lose what they've created in the last 20 years, no matter how small it may seem to us. So how can Iran become more moderate? Well, you have the June 2009 presidential election. If Ahmadinejad doesn't win and a relative moderate figure wins that election, Iran could pursue more moderate policies. Khatami is thinking about running for president. Who knows if he will. If the Iranian elite doesn't feel a direct and immediate threat from the US, then it might be convinced to pursue more moderate policies and cooperate with the US and the region. Also, we have to consider the intense economic pressure Iran is facing. Inflation is 30% right now. The price of oil is going down. Ahmadinejad, when he became president, promised to put oil money on the people's table. He's done exactly the opposite. And there was a recent survey conducted by the Iranian parliament this week that showed that 70% of Iranians would not vote for him. So he's not a popular figure. That doesn't mean he won't become president, because elections in Iran are so structured and the Guardian Council controls them, and Khamenei has a say, of course. Iran also faces other limitations in the region. It's a Shia state, it's not Sunni. It's Persian, not Arab. And I have a very hard time seeing Arab countries following a hegemonic Persian power. They're a very different culture. A system of government has no counterpart, none, in the Sunni or Shia world. The only Arab party that has adopted the Iranian model to a certain degree is Hezbollah, and that's about it. Like I said, it has a very weak military, although it's improving, but it's light years behind the United States in military capability. And it faces many internal challenges. It faces a lot of opposition from women's rights groups, ethnic minorities, and even the Bazaris, the traditional merchant class in Iran, who basically rioted last week in protest against the value-added tax that the government was imposing on them. The government is trying to get more money out of the population because of Iran's tax system, and as the price of oil is going down, it has to resort to other means to make up for its shortfall. Well, the Bazaris didn't really like it. I think for the long term, there are signs of hope. Signs of hope for Iran. In the grand scheme of things, I think the Iranian population is relatively cosmopolitan. It's well educated and quite fond of the U.S. There's real hunger in Iran for achieving change, and every Iranian I talk to wants change in Iran. They don't want to do it through violent means. it has to be nonviolent. And the U.S. should encourage the slow transformation of Iran by adopting long-term policies. It should think about engaging Iran rather than isolating it. I don't think isolating it has produced any results. If anything, it's empowered the Iranian government. As long as the Iranian government has access to oil money, it's okay. But instead of having a grand bargain with Iran, instead of abandoning our allies, we should take small steps. I think the establishment of the interest section is a good step if the Iranian government allows it to happen. And the reason for that is anti-Americanism is a big pillar of the Islamic Republic. It's one of its foundations. So if you take that away, the regime could again be in trouble. But I think the United States, in trying to engage Iran, will be pursuing a correct policy. Thank you.
Okay, if I could just pose a question to each of you and then open it up to the floor. Bob, let me start with you, if I may. You made a very powerful statement about the need for the United States to, in effect, turn a friendly face, or at least a positive face, towards Iran, possibly at the expense of its traditional allies. In your presentation, you did not mention Israel. And that, of course, is the conundrum for the Middle East, inevitably, but I wonder where you come out on that in your statement.
Well, there's two things that have happened that struck me, and one is Olmert, it was 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, said Israel needs to implement Resolution 242, West Bank, part of East Jerusalem, and Gaza, and let's get on with it. Now, the last time I heard that was from somebody on the other side, and that was from Hezbollah, who said, look, we don't care what the Palestinians, whatever they want, we'll accept. Heard this from the Iranians as well. Ahmadinejad and a small minority in Iran believe in wiping Israel off the map, and so do some Arabs. But the point is that when you hear this dialogue from a conservative Israeli and from Hezbollah, it tells me it's open. Now, you're going to have to test this. I mean, why should they tell an ex-CIA guy the truth at all? But this is what they're saying. I think that there's an enormous amount of room if everybody wants to take that step. Otherwise, if Israel continues to confront Iran, there's always, what they're calling it, well, we're running out of time, but the October surprise, where the Israelis are saying, Iran is too big, it's too powerful, especially if we were to leave Iraq, and we need to hit the Iranians. That's always going to be a threat hanging over this town. That's the negative side, but I think that we've got room to talk.
Okay. Ali Nada, you spoke of the situation in Iran and quoted Ahmadinejad as saying that their nuclear program was like a train without brakes. As we recall, earlier this year, there was a national intelligence estimate which was not welcomed by the administration here, but was certainly welcomed by the Iranians. Do you interpret that as one sign of Iranian restraint? That is, number one, do you accept that they have stopped their progress on the weaponization and nuclear weaponization program? And two, would you accept that as a sign of what you described as restraint?
Well, there was some controversy regarding the wording of the NIE. It implied that the weaponization part of the nuclear program had stopped. And if you look at the nuclear program, it started during the Shah's time in the 60s, and it's not clear as to how clearly it's a weapons program or a civilian program. I think it's probably both. And with Iran, and I think the former Iranian National Security Advisor, Hassan Rouhani, admitted this. He was the National Security Advisor under Khatami. He said that when we negotiated with the IAEA and halted uranium enrichment, that allowed us to work on other aspects of the nuclear program. He hinted that that helped Iran achieve some of its goals. So when you say Iran stopped the weaponization of its nuclear program, it's possible it stopped certain aspects of it. But in terms of uranium enrichment and building the infrastructure for ultimately a nuclear weapon, I don't think that's the case. And with the nuclear program, if Iran has shown restraint, it's been part of a diplomatic strategy to buy it time rather than forego nuclear weapons completely. With Iran, and the nuclear program is not just about Israel, it's about deterrence. I lived in Tehran during the Iran-Iraq war, and it was terrifying. The Scud missiles and Iraqi jets, they really pummeled the population, and it's really left a psychological imprint on Iran and Iranians. And I think the nuclear program is to ensure not just the survival of the Islamic Republic, but to defend Iran, especially since its military is pretty weak.
Okay. And Keith, last question. You described an Iranian going through a state of change, certainly demographically, people the seeking jobs, seeking a different Iran. Going back to Bob Baer's statement about the need for us to turn a friendlier face towards Iran, you also touched on that, but do you see a need for a greater urgency given the weaponization program that's possible in Iran? You described several features that could be done, blockades and so forth, but do you see a greater need for the friendly face? Let me put it that way.
I guess I'm pretty pessimistic on the nuclear program. I think what will happen, the debate in Iran, and Ali can correct me, seems to be between those who want to go all the way to weaponization, or you go to almost to that level. And there's a number of states have actually, in the world have a situation where they have enrichment facilities, they have enriched uranium, so it'd be fairly easily to go all the way to a bomb. But I think that most people in the policymaking community are kind of convinced that Iran will be in a position to either have a weapon or have enough fissile material that they can make weapons. So I don't really see our policies, so the question is, what do you do about it? We've done other work at RAND, we've looked at it. One of the problems of bombing this stuff, if you go and you bomb enrichment facilities, is then what do you do? Because there's been an effort in order to put them underground, and the real problem with these types of facilities is really what people have in their minds. It's not so much the centrifuges. If you could take all the centrifuges out, okay, that would be fine, but it's very difficult to do something like that, so you kind of postpone it. So I think the argument we have here is that putting aside the nuclear issues, what you want to do is have a government come to power in Iran that would do what the South Africans have done, what the Libyans have done. Argentina and Brazil actually had nuclear weapons programs or nuclear programs in the 60s and 70s, and fortunately they said, well, why are we doing this? So, this is crazy. And you'd hopeful that they back down. And I think so the idea here has been that you need to work with the populace and hopefully get a saner government. Parts of this Iranian government are quite nasty, and the idea that you're going to talk to them doesn't mean that they're not going to be nasty anymore. So I think that both political candidates take a pretty cautious view about what you can get out of negotiations. The idea being here more that you want to work with the Iranian people so that over time you'd see a change in government or change in the flavor of the way the country works.
Okay. Thank you. Why don't we open it up? What I would ask you to do, we have a microphone on, a roaming microphone on either side of the room. Amanda Olke, our Director of Adult Programs, and Laura Hicken, also in that staff. If you would wait for the microphone, that way everybody can hear the question. So, Laura, I have one right down here in front. Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to thank all the speakers.
You're on. Just hold it up.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for your insights and understanding of the Middle East, and in particular Iran. I noticed that all of you spoke about the importance of oil for Iran, both as a focus of its power and of its policy and wealth. And Bob in particular spoke about not only the fact that it is an oil-producing nation, but that it has the missile capacity to help destroy the oil capacity of its neighbors. And therefore, my question to you concerns pulling the rug out from under them by the development of alternate energy, and in particular, the development of microdiesel, diesel produced from genetically engineered bacteria, something which is feasible, which has been demonstrated in the lab from E. coli, by retooling sewage treatment plants, something that's feasible within the United States much faster and much shorter time frame than, for example, drilling for oil. What would be Iran's response, and I ask this of each of you, if we in fact did a serious national effort to produce an alternate fuel method such as this, such as microdiesel, that can be done, would be cheaper than oil right now?
Okay, thank you.
It's just not micro.
Bob, you want to lead off?
Yeah, it's not microdiesel. I mean, it's just alternative energy. I think what we've learned from Iraq is it's Humpty Dumpty can't be put back together, at least like it was. And having served in the Middle East and failed utterly to change the political direction of any country I served in, you know, we can't fix it. And if we can't fix it, we can either fight a 30 years war to contain Iran or come home and find alternative energy, whether it's microdiesel or solar or clean nuclear or anything. It just, you know, the Middle East is, my opinion, I always have a certain bias, is we can't fix it. They're either going to fix it themselves in terms of democracy and ethnic reconciliation, or it's not going to be fixed, but we're not going to do it. So I agree with you.
Keith?
You know, you could use a tax word here. Taxes on carbon fuels is a great thing to do. I think the question is whether American voters are willing to go ahead and really put some heavy taxes on carbon-based fuels. Maybe if we all got rebates from the carbon-based taxes, that would work. I've done an awful lot of work on renewables and other things. We've looked at the disaster that ethanol subsidies have gone to the United States. We've had, you know, food prices skyrocketing around the world. We've had riots. You know, when you think about we were using 20 million barrels per day. We don't produce that much sewage to make 20 million barrels a day out of E. coli. I think that we've put $300 billion into energy research over the last 30 years. A lot of it's gone to fusion. When I was in grade school, they said fusion energy be around the corner in 20 years, and today I've got grandchildren. We're still saying fusion energy is around the corner in 20 years. I don't think U.S. taxpayers' money should be used on research. I think the private sector should go ahead and do that. And if it makes sense, it's fine. But I think it's great if we'd really tax carbon very, very heavily, and we could use that to cut other taxes, and then we'll see what happens.
Okay, Ali Nader?
I think that's a great question. The issue isn't that the U.S. is dependent on Middle East oil. I think it only gets a very small portion of its oil from the Middle East, 11% if I'm correct.
No Iranian oil at all.
No Iranian oil at all. The problem is that the rest of the world gets a lot of its oil from the Middle East, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Indians. So it's not just us adopting certain policies to reduce our dependence on oil. And Iran isn't strategic because it's selling oil to the United States. It's strategic because it has enormous reserves and it can interrupt shipping in the Persian Gulf. As to whether it would affect Iran if, let's say, the entire world switched to alternative fuel, I think oil has been really a curse and blessing for Iran, but in a lot of ways it has been a curse. It doesn't have a diversified economy. The great natural resources it has have compelled other countries to invade it, to interfere in its affairs. So in the long run, could Iran be better off? Perhaps, but given how dysfunctional and poorly planned it is, and how poorly planned its economy is, I think any fluctuation in oil prices or switching to alternative energy could really affect not just the geopolitical situation in the region, but politics in Iran.
Okay, thank you. Let me take one from over here. Amanda, you have one?
Yes, I'd like to ask with regard to presidential candidates, East and West, have you been pleased, appalled, indifferent, or whatever with regard to the ones that we have in the United States regarding Iran? And what are the prospects for people running in the Iranian election? Are there others besides Ahmadinejad and Hatemi who are likely prospects that there's a buzz on? And is our present president of Iran eager to have another go at it?
Okay, does anyone want to take that question?
Well, in terms of Iranian politics, I think nobody can tell who's going to become president. Nobody can predict it. No one could even fathom that Ahmadinejad would become president in 2005. He was only the mayor of Tehran, and so it was a shock to the system. With Iranian politics and elections, they're very different than what we have in the United States, arguably. They're structured, so candidates can be disqualified, ballots can be stuffed. So there's really no point in discussing who will become president at this point. And as I said, the ultimate decision is made by the supreme leader and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and various state institutions. I think if you have somebody like Khatami come to power in Iran, and he didn't do very much for Iran anyhow, I think a large portion of the Iranian population is deeply disappointed with him. But in terms of rhetoric, style, and substance, he is immoderate. And he dresses well, he behaves well, he doesn't make a fool of himself in front of the camera. And I think those are qualities that can help Iran diplomatically. But I'm not very optimistic about an ultimate Iranian-U.S. rapprochement. I think it's going to take a lot. We're talking about Israel before. Israel is a major, major sticking point. I can't ever see the supreme leader of Iran accepting Israel. He's adamantly against its existence. And in that way, Iran is deeply ideological.
Okay. All right, the tighter the question, the more we can run by our speakers. How about one over here?
Oh, I don't really have an opinion.
Okay.
Well, I look at it as a Nixon moment. If you could bring McCain to reason, he would be the candidate to convince the American people we had to do this. When Nixon went to Peking in '74. From a Republican standpoint, it's going to be hard for Obama in the middle of a recession to make a huge foreign policy gesture to Iran and not be, accused of capitulation. That's the way I see it.
Okay, right here, Laura.
Yes, I'd like to ask the panel what they feel about the possibility of an Israeli attack upon Iran sometime fairly soon.
Okay. Does anybody want to take it, or you all three want to take a crack at that?
I can start. I think it's a great probability. I think what Iran is doing is basically pushing Israel into a corner, especially with this rhetoric, the rhetoric of its president. So I think it's a possibility. Perhaps the Israelis are waiting for the right time. Perhaps right now is not the right time. But when you're a country of 5-6 million people and a country 10 times your size with 10 times your population is threatening to destroy you, you have to take defensive measures. I'm not sure if the Israelis could really take out Iran's entire nuclear program. I'm not sure what kind of intelligence they have. A lot of the facilities in Iran are known to the UN Security Council and the IAEA, but who knows if Iran has a parallel program. There are a lot of unknowns.
Okay. Any other comments, Keith? Bob? Keith?
Yeah, I think the Israeli national security establishment really has to think hard about whether deterrent. I mean, we used deterrence for decades with the Soviet Union. We have a deterrence policy with China. Whether deterrence is an adequate response, you really do have a major problem. In one of my colleagues talks about North Korea. The United States thought about bombing the North Korean facilities in '93, '94, and you came up with, well, then what happens? And so I think there's been a lot of concern that you take out part of the facilities, you take out some of the facilities, but the problem doesn't go away.
It's also going to depend on us what happens in Iraq. If we were to precipitously leave and Baghdad were to follow under Iran's shadow, the Israelis are going to start feeling surrounded. And if that, the domino effect didn't work in East Asia, it's much more applicable in the Middle East in terms of a hegemon, which Iran would become, and as an example to the Palestinians. If the Israelis start getting hit by Hamas and a couple rockets from Hezbollah, I don't see how they cannot react. They just simply, a government cannot withstand being surrounded, and it's, they're going to turn the table over.
Okay. Other questions? One right down here, Amanda, and then I've got one back there. And is there one way back there too? Yes. Okay, Laura over there. Let's take this one first.
Thank you. This is a question, I guess, mainly for Mr. Baer. Would you comment on the current relationship between the Iranian government and Hezbollah? How much control does Tehran have, and would they be possible to use it as threatened as a retaliation against the U.S. the West again in response to an attack on Iran?
I think to answer the last part of your question first, I think we could almost count on Hezbollah responding to an attack on Iran, and I think the Israelis are counting on it. Hezbollah says they've trebled the size of their missile force since 2006. They're still hidden. They got better ranges. These tandem explosives, tandem charges, these RPG-29s have come via Iran. Iran's funding this. These are extremely effective against armor. So you see this weaponry ratcheting up, and there's no direct relation that we know about between Russia and Hezbollah, so this is coming via Iran. And Nasrallah his answers to Iran. I mean, he needs the money to rebuild the southern suburbs, and he was created by Iran in 1982, and he's been a loyal officer in their ranks, and I think he really believes in this great Iranian, what I call empire by proxy. So I think, this is the Iranians managing to cross this ethnic divide to Arabs, which is so scary to the Jordanians and to the Israelis. They live this every day. I mean, we tend to fall back on the opinion that, well, the Iraqis are going to reassert themselves as Iraqis because they're Arabs, and they didn't fight during the 88 war. But I think the Iranians understand how to reverse this, at least for temporarily in Iraq. And that's what, so I think the Israelis are worried about things getting worse. And it depends what we do. If we get up and leave in Iraq and, hand the government over to Maliki and he allies with Iran, the Israelis are really going to be scared.
Okay, there was one back here, Laura.
Hi, I'm curious to know the panel's thoughts on the movement to privatize industry in Iran, and with the younger population getting towards the working age, if that's going to gain momentum, lose momentum, and if it'll have any lasting social or political effects.
There was a lot of progress is made under Khatami. What has happened, unfortunately, over the last 3 years is the privatization program has really gone awry, and the Ahmadinejad government has really set it up so the bonyads and which are these foundations controlled by the IGRC IRGC, excuse me, are really taking over these companies. So you aren't seeing the type of privatization that you saw up until about 2002, 2003. In a lot of ways, Iran has really gone backwards over the last 3 years. You had some liberalization of the banking system. You had some private banks taking off, and they could lend to companies on the basis of their creditworthiness. And so I would hope that if you had a new president, you might see some revitalization of the privatization program. But right now, it's kind of a mess.
Okay, there's one right here, Amanda, and then, excuse me, this fellow, right, yes, right there.
Is there any possibility of a behind-the-scenes rapprochement between Israel and Iran? Both have historical connections that have never been wholly severed, and each would have a lot to gain by reaching an accommodation.
That's a fantastic question. That's exactly my view. The way if things are, rapprochement happens, it's going to be the Israelis go privately. There's a lot of Iranians still visit Israel. A lot of Israeli ministers of Iranian origin. There's a lot of good connections. There's the whole idea of surrounding the Arabs, the Persians, and the Israelis. And if there's a breakthrough, it's not going to be, McCain flying to Tehran. It's going to be the Israelis coming to Washington and said, we made a deal, an Oslo-type agreement, and here's what we need from you. And I think we would be delighted if that would happen. So, I'd love to see the Israelis pull a rabbit out of their hats.
Can I answer that?
Please.
About a couple of months ago, the Iranian Minister for Tourism, his name is Maeshi, made a comment, and he's Ahmadinejad's in-law, made a comment that we are friends with all people. We're even friends with Americans, and we're friends with the Israeli people. For the past 2 months, he's been pressured to resign. Ayatollah Khamenei made a speech and said, we are not friends with the Israeli people. There's no difference between civilians and military personnel in Israel. They're all the same. They're occupiers. Now, to what extent that's just a function of Iranian politics, it's hard to tell. But if you've been telling your population for nearly 30 years that Israel is this great evil, if there's to be a rapprochement, and I'm not saying Iran can't act pragmatically. There was the Iran-Contra affair. It bought weapons from the Israelis. They probably had secret contacts. Who knows? But if there's to be this grand rapprochement, then you seriously have to change your rhetoric and look like a fool in front of your population. When Khatami was president, he had said that we're willing to accept what the Palestinian people accept. So it's a possibility. But given the nature of power in Iran, it depends who's making the decision. If it's Khatami, there's a good possibility. If it's Khamenei, if it's the IRGC, I think that possibility decreases.
Okay. One right here, Laura, please. And then we'll go back over here, Amanda, the fellow back there in the cap.
Thank you. You've painted a picture of a nation that's very young, very unified politically, more so than certainly I expected. One that is largely educated by Western standards and broadly educated. One that has amazingly open access to communication with the wider world. Given that, how sustainable is the Iranian political system that is kleptocratic, theocratic, and is built on patronage? And what are the prospects that there will be some sort of break with that political system?
Keith or Ali Nader? Yes.
Well, I think an issue the clerical regime in Iran has, it doesn't have very deep roots in Iran. The whole system was in some ways arbitrary. You had the Shah, and he was replaced by an Islamic Republic and a supreme leader, and institutions that had never existed in Iran, like the Guardian Council. So the clergy, not only does it not have roots, and it does to a certain extent, but not among the entire population, but it also doesn't have a lot of widespread support. I can tell you, although Iran is very united in some ways, it's also a very divided society. Secular and nationalistic Iranians look at the clergy and, a lot of them think they're from another world. So there are those divisions within Iran. I can't tell you how sustainable it is because there are tools the Iranian government has that has kept it in power. It controls the armed forces. It has a pretty good security system. It controls the economy. It's diversified politically, so not one person is making decisions. So it's not a matter of getting rid of Ahmadinejad or Khamenei. There are a lot of players in Iran. What can happen in Iran, and what's happening right now is the clergy's power is being reduced. And it's being challenged by lay people like Ahmadinejad, but also by the IRGC. So, and we've looked at this extensively at RAND. There's a possibility that in the following years you can see a government that's less clerical but more military. And that's happened in the last few years, especially since Ahmadinejad came to power. The IRGC has taken a lot of power in Iran. And it's conceivable, if the supreme leader died tomorrow, I'm not saying he will, but if that happens, there could be a shift in power. Another group can come to the forefront. And in that way, politics in Iran could slowly change. But I also think one thing a lot of people don't understand about Iran is it is isolated from the world in some ways, but its population is actually pretty worldly. It's aware of what's going on. It has access to information. A lot of Iranians watch BBC or Voice of America, so it's just not Iranian media that dominates the information space in Iran. So they know what's going on, and I think the population has matured a lot politically since the revolution. There's no knee-jerk reaction to what a certain Ayatollah says. Like I said in the beginning years, people really supported the Islamic Republic. They wanted to export the revolution. There was this great fervor, and I think that's mostly gone. There are groups of people who feel very passionately about the Islamic Republic, but the majority of the population, I would argue, does not. And that's where we should look for changes in Iran.
Okay. Any other comment? Keith, Bob? Okay, I think we had right back here, Amanda.
This question is primarily directed at Mr. Baer. Given the, I guess, the considerable networks that Iran has built up in the region, combined with the almost conspiratorial mindset of a lot of the people in the Middle East, are you seeing a resurgence of, I guess, old Soviet active measures like operations being conducted by the Iranians?
I think the Iranians are bringing rockets into Gaza. They're certainly trying to control us remotely. They can't put people in Gaza. They are trying to spread the Hamas organization to the West Bank. They are holding these rockets as a deterrent. They are attempting to get into the Palestinian camps in Jordan in particular. They're casting the Jordanian regime as capitulating to the United States, that the Palestinians are going to get nothing. And this is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that's out there, and then you've got a faction in the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, which is also is reaching out to people, but they're mainly focusing on Iraq at this point. Now, earlier this year, there was inside the administration a look at the possibility, what to do about Iran. You could wait for the price of oil to fall and see what shakes out in a sort of social revolution, which we may see pretty soon. That doesn't always guarantee a regime change. We're in a pre-revolutionary state, but there was a look earlier this year of supporting Jindala, which is a Baluch group that spans the border between Pakistan and Iran. It's a very violent group. It has connections with Al-Qaeda. There was a look by the administration of supporting Sunni extremists in Lebanon, which would be a deterrent to, or a counterpoise to Hezbollah. And then you've got the Kurds. The problem is, that's the Iranians' worst fear, is that they become the Shia power against the Sunni, and they're outnumbered. What they want to have is a universal revolution, and if we were taking the same Machiavellian approach to the world, we would drive a wedge between the Sunni and the Shia. But the problem is, you get civil war, and it starts to look a lot like the Mad Max approach to the Middle East, and it could really backfire.
Okay. Question right down here, Amanda, front.
Hello. I'm curious as to what effect, if we were able to achieve a rapprochement with Iran, what sort of effect that would have on prospects for more democratic reform and change within the country itself. Do you think this would strengthen reformers, or would this sort of be seen as a credibility, a foreign policy victory for the ruling regime of the past few years, the conservatives?
Could I just, I'm sure you want to comment. The cliche way of looking at it is, if there was a rapprochement, we solved Iraq and Afghanistan, we left, the paranoia in Iran would go down. But I mean, our rapprochement with China didn't make it a less, more progressive democratic government. So you can't predict these political things, but I'll defer.
No, I would agree, actually. If if the rapprochement basically, what the Iranian government wants, it's an acknowledgement of a system of government from the United States. It wants some sort of security guarantee. It wants to play a major role in the region, especially in the Persian Gulf. If there's a resumption of relations and we give those things to Iran, and they have to give some things back, of course, but if that's not followed up with Iran's economic opening and social opening, and if Iranians are not allowed to travel outside, if political change does not take place, in a lot of ways a rapprochement can actually strengthen the Iranian government. So it depends what policies we pursue with Iran. I think we have to be very careful when we talk about negotiating with them, what we're negotiating exactly. If they're to give up their nuclear program, what are we willing to give them in return? Because the nuclear program is not the major issue. It's the Islamic Republic and the relationship it has with the U.S. So ultimately, that relationship has to fundamentally change, and the Islamic Republic has to allow reforms within the country.
Okay. Bob Baer, Keith Crane, Ali Nader, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Okay, Bob and Keith will be available in the back for signing their books. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Have a good rest of the evening.